I'm going to talk about the BLM effect. The FBI released their crime statistics for 2020, and surprise, surprise, there was a huge increase in the murder rate in the United States. In 2019, according to the FBI statistics, there were 16,669 murders, or what they call non-negligent homicide, which includes manslaughter. There are different ways of defining this sort of thing. There's a legal definition, which involves a decision by a judge or jury, like a court decision. There is a law enforcement definition, and then there is a medical definition, and these things can get mixed up. But, I'm just going to use the word murder here, and what it means is that a person kills another person, and it's either that they're intending to kill the person or they're intending to harm them, so there's an intent to do some kind of violence or, criminal activity, and as a result, somebody ends up dead. All right, so that's what we're talking about when I use the word murder. All right, so anyway, back to the statistics. In 2019, there were 16,669 murders. And in 2020, there were 21,570 murders. That is 4,901 additional murders, which is an increase of 29.4%. So almost 30%. Now, I also looked at the CDC data on this, and you get somewhat bigger numbers, and I suspect that their numbers are more accurate because they probably have better data collection methods. The FBI aggregate data from law enforcement agencies around the United States, whereas the CDC are aggregating medical data probably from hospitals or from coroners or from doctors. I'm not sure, but my guess is that their numbers are more accurate. So anyway, according to the CDC, there were 19,141 deaths by what they call assault homicide. That's an ICD-10 code, if you're familiar with that sort of thing. And that covers, guns, knives, whatever. And in 2020, there were 24,691 deaths of that type, which is an increase of 5,550, and that's also roughly 29% increase. So the percentages line up almost exactly, even though the CDC's numbers are bigger. Now, another possible reason why it's bigger is that it might include legal homicide, like criminals killed by police or people killed in self-defense. I'm not sure. But it probably reflects the increase in violent death, let's put it that way. According to the Washington Post, there were 999 police killings in the United States in 2019 and 1,021 in 2020, so not a huge increase. The number of police killings has only gone up by roughly 20, right? So that's not an explanation. Here is a chart that shows the homicide deaths per month from the CDC. As you can see, it jumped up in May of 2020 to a higher rate and has more or less stayed at that higher rate since. Or at least it did through 2020. I'm not sure about the more recent months. I'd have to look into that. But at least during 2020, there was a change around May, and I don't think it's a coincidence that it was May when George Floyd died and all the rioting the mostly peaceful protesting began and all the chaos and the calls to defund the police and all that stuff. Well, that all started in May of 2020, and it just happened to coincide with a huge increase in the murder rate. All right, so here are murder victims by race based on FBI statistics. In 2019, 41.9% of murder victims were white, and this includes most Hispanics, even if they are of mixed European and Native American ancestry. 53.5% of murder victims were black. 3.1% were of another race, like East Asian, South Asian, Native Hawaiian, etc. And 1.6% were unknown, and that could mean that the race couldn't be determined because they fell into multiple categories or something like that. And I should say that I don't know exactly what percentage of the U.S. population would be categorized as white using the FBI's racial categories, but the black percentage of the U.S. population is about 13.4%. So although blacks are only 13.4% of the U.S. population, 53.5% of the murder victims were black. So blacks are disproportionately affected by murder. And in 2020, that percentage increased. The absolute numbers went up for every category, but they went up more for blacks. And so the percentage of blacks went up from 53.5% to 56.6%, while percentages for the other categories went down, except for unknown that went up slightly. Whites were 39.5% of murder victims in 2020. The other category was 2.9% and unknown was 1.8%. Right? So the big story there is that the increase in the murder rate disproportionately affected blacks. It affected everyone, but it affected blacks more. And the same thing is true if you look at murder offenders by race. In 2019, 41.8% of murder offenders were white, and again, that includes most Hispanics. In 2020, 40.6% were white. In 2019, 55.3% of murder offenders were black, and in 2020, 56.6% were black. In 2019, 2.9% fell into another category, which could include other races or unknown race, but it does not include unknown perpetrator. So I excluded those statistics. So when I calculated the percentages, it only includes offenses for which the race was known. And if you add up other and white, you get 44.7% non-black in 2019 versus 43.4% in 2020. And there are a number of interesting things about this. Obviously, the fact that blacks commit a majority of the murder, despite being only 13.4% of the population, is quite astonishing, right? The other 86.6% of the population commits only 43.4% of all murders, while the 13.4% commits 56.6%, right? Using 2020 statistics. And then also the disproportionality has gone up as well as the absolute numbers of murders. Another way to look at this is that blacks were about 8.5 times more likely to be murder victims or murder offenders than non-blacks. And you can compare that to the ratio of male to female murder offenders, which is 7.5 to 1. So men are 7.5 times more likely to commit murder than women, whereas blacks are about 8.5 times more likely to commit murder in the United States than non-blacks. All right. Now we know, most people who don't have ideological blinders on know why men are more likely to commit murder. It's biological. It's our, part of our life strategy. We're more aggressive, we're more violent, we compete for mates and territory and resources, and we evolved to be like that. And so men are more likely to commit murder. We're the more aggressive and violent sex. But it is quite astonishing that the racial disparity is bigger than the sexual disparity. But anyway, I've talked about that before. Now, what is the cause of this increase? Well, I've already said it's, probably mostly due to the effects of the Black Lives Matter crowd mania that followed George Floyd's death. We had months of mostly peaceful protests, according to the media, right? That's kind of a meme now. It's the media's way of describing a riot. We had calls to defund the police. There was some defunding of police in certain areas. There were autonomous zones set up in certain cities. We had police resources diverted to suppressing riots and enforcing COVID regulations. And there was a demonization of the police, like they were made to be the bad guys in this moral narrative. And of course, that's going to cause demoralization. And it's also going to discourage them from doing their jobs from, if they don't feel that the people or the government have their back. And, if the culture doesn't have moral support for the police, then they're not going to do as efficient a job. And I think all of those things combined to increase the murder rate. And I guess also the moral justification given by the media and by left-wing ideology for black criminality. That instead of the responsibility being placed on blacks, they're being told that they're victims and that, everything is society's fault or the white man's fault. That, they're victims of racism and all this, rather than being told that they are responsible for their own behavior. But anyway, it was some combination of those things. And not only does this undercut ideological beliefs about race, it also undercuts ideological beliefs about crime. To me, it's just an obvious fact that police prevent crime, but to many people, not even just on the left, but even to many just ordinary people, they don't believe that, because they believe that human beings are essentially good. And so the police are only there to enforce the law, to catch the occasional sociopath or psychopath, right? They view crime as being a kind of pathology or driven by something other than human nature. Whereas I view violent crime and crime in general as a natural behavior for human beings, that we naturally kill, rape, steal, and so on. And that if you want to have a peaceful society, you have to impose laws on the population by force. So if you have less policing, you're going to have more violence, you're going to have more crime. And that theory predicts what we see. But it is heresy, right? It's yet another heresy against humanism, against belief in magical human nature. I wanted to say that this is not only the responsibility of the establishment. Certainly, they played a major role in generating the mass hysteria. They played a major role in the events that followed George Floyd's death. They should have tried to prevent mass hysteria, but instead they promoted it. They bought into it. But it was largely driven from the bottom up. It was largely driven by people emotionally reacting to a video and virtue signaling on social media rather than trying to understand a reality. Right? Like, I don't know if Stalin actually said this, but it's a great quote, even if he didn't say it. I mean, it would be even better, I suppose, if someone other than Stalin had said it. A single death is a tragedy. A million deaths is a statistic. And that's kind of what's going on here. The 5,500 additional dead bodies will get much less media coverage than the single death of a drug addict and criminal who was resisting arrest. So consider that this increase in the murder rate is going to get less coverage by the media, less attention from the public and governments than one death of one, drug addict, criminal who was resisting arrest, He has been canonized. He is now St. George Floyd, the, innocent and holy. He has statues and all this other nonsense, right? I mean, this is truly insane. And this kind of insanity has consequences. Thousands of people have died because of a false narrative. Thousands of people have died because of Black Lives Matter. That's the truth. Now, some people have tried to explain it in terms of other causes, and the most obvious alternative is COVID. So I looked into this a bit. I looked at other countries. Canada, which is adjacent to the United States, both physically and culturally, had about a 7% increase in the murder rate. Not a huge increase, but a 7% increase. Of course, Canada was affected by the Black Lives Matter hysteria. Countries that are more removed from the United States culturally and physically had little or no effect on the murder rate during the period of, COVID lockdowns and so on. Italy, for example, was very heavily affected by COVID, and they had a decrease in the murder rate. France had a slight decrease in the murder rate. So many countries had a decrease in the murder rate at this time, while the US had a 30% increase. So there may have been some other factors, like I would be willing to consider the possibility that maybe COVID did play a role. Perhaps, some of the, even the lockdowns maybe pushed people into despair or whatever. I mean, I don't know. But I think the obvious cause is obvious. Unless we're trying to deny it for an ideological reason, it's not that hard to explain. You demoralize the police, defund the police, encourage rioting, give moral support to rioters and criminals, and you get more crime. Wow, what a shock. You get more violent crime. You get more murders. You tell the police, if you police black people, then you might not only lose your job, you might go to prison. Well, then police are not going to enforce the law as strictly in black areas, and guess what? The murder rate goes up. Well, again, big surprise, right? No, it's not a surprise. And people on the dissident right, of course, predicted this, and so now we're just kind of saying, I told you so, and we will be ignored, and things will go on, Clown world will continue. So I guess just get used to it, right? It's the world we live in now. All right, as always, thanks for listening.